service organisations for our members and our friends and allied organisations that work with children and young people. Right now, we know that too many Victorian children are being held back from achieving their full potential because they haven't had the requisite literacy support that they need in their crucial early years. We now stand at a really significant turning point. In June this year, the Victorian government announced a bold reform that will transform how we teach reading in our schools. So starting in term 1 next year, we'll see one of the most significant shifts in education policy in recent years: the implementation of systematic phonics instruction across all government schools. And this just isn't just another policy change. It really is a commitment to giving every child the foundation they need to succeed using methods that are proven to work. And that's why VCOSS has partnered today with the Department of Education to host this vital information session. We're here to help understand the changes, to ask questions, and most importantly, have a conversation about how we ensure that this reform truly serves every child in our community, especially those who need our support most. And as all of you know on this call, the thing that really drives the community services sector, and I know is a shared imperative for our colleagues at the Department of Education, is around education equity. We bring a really strong equity lens to these conversations. We're really grateful to our colleagues at the Victorian Department of Education for all the time and energy that they've put into preparing for the conversation today. We're going to start with a presentation from guest speakers. So we have Mark Anderson, who's going to kick us off. Mark is the Acting Executive Director of Curriculum and Teaching Practice Division. We have Lucinda Edsilius, who's the Acting Director of Teaching and Learning, Tim Wilson, Acting Director of Lesson Plans, and Louise Stewart, Director of Literacy, Languages, the Arts and the Humanities. So we'll hear from our colleagues from the Department of Education, and then we've allowed enough time, about 25 minutes of Q&A. So please, as you're hearing the presentations today, don't hesitate to start putting questions into the chat. I just want to check with my VCOSS colleagues. I think we're using the chat function to put questions in, and we'll read those out during the Q&A. But we'll see how we go, because alternatively, if that gets a bit clunky, what we might do is end up kind of moving to just inviting people to put their hands up. But in the first instance, perhaps use that chat function to put your questions in. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Mark with colleagues Lucinda, Tim and Louise to kick us off with the presentation. Thank you so much, Mark.
Deb, thanks for that lovely introduction, and you're welcome. Yes, it's Mark Anderson. So I'm the Acting Executive Director for the Curriculum Teaching Practice Division here in the department, and would want to add my acknowledgement of country. We're also dialing in today from Wurundjeri land, so we pay respect to elders and to any Aboriginal colleagues joining us on the call today. So the Curriculum Teaching Practice Division does exactly that. That's the work that we do in the department. We take a lead role on supporting schools across the state to implement the Victorian curriculum, but we're also leading on the development and the support for the implementation of the new teaching and learning approaches, which you've heard a lot about through ministerial announcements and so forth. So today we'll be talking to you a little bit about the Victorian lesson plan, the Victorian teaching and learning model and the changes to that, and also the approach to the teaching of reading in F2, which I know you'll all be really interested in. So Deb's kindly introduced the members of the team. They're all leading on various portfolios, and I'm going to hand you straight over to Lucinda, who's going to take us into the first part of today's presentation. So thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks very much, Mark. And sorry, I went to unmute myself and realised I was whizzing through slides. So apologies, everybody. It's lovely to be with you today. And I'm very mindful of the diversity of organisations we have on the call, and looking forward to the question and answer session at the following our presentation to table some of your key interests in this exciting work. I'm going to start with a bit of a zoom out, if you like, to give you some of the context and the strategic framework in which we're thinking about about this new approach to reading across Victoria. I'll talk through a little bit about the refreshed education state and the Victorian Teaching and Learning Model version 2, which was launched in June at the same time as the new approach to reading. And I'll then pass to Louise Stewart, my colleague, who will talk to you about the new approach to reading in some more detail, and my colleague Tim Wilson, who will have a chat about the lesson plans. And we'll finish with some Q&A at the end. So in October, our Minister for Education launched a refreshed statement of direction, the Education State, Education Excellence in Every Classroom. The Victorian Government's vision for the education state is to deliver this in every classroom in every corner of the state. And as the universal service provider of education across this state, we take that commitment very seriously indeed. This vision is shared and developed in consultation with Victorian students, families, teachers, school leaders, and the wider workforce. And I hope it is not a surprise to you. We have been the education state for a very long time, indeed since 1872, when we were the first colony to enact an Education Act. And I think we're still the only jurisdiction to have Victoria as the education state on our number plates. But excellence in every classroom is still something that we are committed to working very hard to deliver every day. And included in that statement is, of course, the underpinning of there needs to be equitable access to excellence in every classroom. The refreshed education state has 5 priority areas, and I'll read them out just quickly. Excellence in teaching and learning, every student matters, lifting secondary school student engagement and achievement, expanding, supporting and recognising our school workforce, and embedding our schools at the centre of our communities. The reforms that I'm going to talk to you about today, of course, speak very strongly to that first one, excellence in teaching and learning. They also touch on and support the achievement of some of the other ones, particularly every student matters, lifting engagement and recognising our workforce, helping them to demonstrate excellence in classrooms. So these reform directions were informed by our analysis of our system's performance, and Victoria is a strong performer across the nation, which is very pleasing. We have achieved first or second rank in 8 out of 10 NAPLAN domains in primary year levels, more than any other jurisdiction. And that includes the ACT, which is always a particular pleasure to us because we know we have considerably more diversity across our state than is prevalent in the ACT. So it feels like a real achievement there. We also have the best overall attendance rates in the country, which is kind of a key gateway indicator for us. And we are thrilled with what our school leaders and teachers have achieved in supporting our students, particularly returning to school following the 2020-2021 remote and flexible learning period. It's a tribute to their efforts. We recognise that we've got some really key challenges and we're very keen to do something about these. We know that school engagement declines in the early secondary years of years 7 to 9. We know that numeracy is a national challenge and that is true of Victoria as well, particularly in the secondary years. We still have an enduring and unacceptable gap, unacceptable to all of us, gap in the educational outcomes of students that aligns with socioeconomic backgrounds and levels of disadvantage. And our school workforce supply, workload and wellbeing, consistently with the challenge across the nation, remains a challenge in Victoria. We are seeing some really positive green shoots, you could say, in that direction. Our secondary teaching scholarships have definitely made an impact, and we've seen a 23% increase in the number of people enrolling in undergraduate initial teacher education this year, which is very pleasing indeed. We have lifted the overall numbers of our teaching workforce, but with our expanding population numbers and some of our challenges in more remote areas, we know that there's still more work to do in that area too. So what are these key reforms that will drive the achievement of that first priority of the refreshed education state? We've got the revised Victorian Teaching and Learning Model number 2 standing there on the left. We've got the reading position and the lesson plans. And we are going to work very closely with our school networks. We have a really sophisticated architecture of not only our regional colleagues, but also networks between our schools, communities of practice, between some of our leading teachers, which we're very keen to strengthen and tap into and support to implement these reforms. We know from studies done in education systems in Victoria and elsewhere that teacher to teacher, school leader to school leader level of peer support and sharing of best practice and experience is a very powerful implementation tool. So quick comparison between the original Victorian teaching and learning model and the current one, and the reason that we have revised it. The original VTLM was implemented several years ago now, and it offered schools a kind of a smorgasbord of practices and teaching approaches that all had an evidentiary basis, but left it to schools to make the decision about which one they were going to use. Since it's been in operation, the department has done a lot of work in areas like disability inclusion and positive classroom management strategies, high impact teaching strategies, of course, and wellbeing, as you can see across the bottom there. And there was starting to emerge a bit of a plethora of guidance within the department. And outside the department, the evidentiary basis, the research community was increasingly finding that the more evidence that emerged, the more the majority of evidence was coalescing around particular understandings. And that happened in terms of our understanding of the way that people learn, and specifically, of course, our students, and also in relation to the teaching practices that are most effective in supporting that learning process. So it was timely to revise our VTLM and share with our teaching profession these findings and the compelling majority of findings and the directions they were giving. We have also found that where Victoria, in contrast to the other jurisdictions of Australia, has long had a strong culture of school autonomy, following, I suppose, partly during the pandemic and following the pandemic, that has shifted a little bit. And increasingly, our schools have been turning to us and saying, well, what do you recommend, department? We've got a whole heap on our plate. You're giving us this smorgasbord of options, but which one is the best? What works most effectively? So all of those things combined led us to establish a partnership with the Australian Education Research Organisation and develop this VTLM version 2. You can see that across the top, it presents the key elements of learning as we've come to understand them, and that's that evidentiary, that first area of evidentiary basis that I was referring to. And then in orange, vertically underneath that, we've got 4 elements of teaching. And I'll talk a little bit more about those now. The key finding that has come out of all this research in cognitive science, neuroscience, and educational psychology is that the process by which we learn is very consistent. Of course, different people have different levels of speed in how they learn, and students walk into our gates with very diverse areas of existing knowledge, but the mechanism of learning, if you like, is consistent across our student cohort. And that was quite an innovation, and quite I suppose it challenged us and made us really think deeply. In the past, as many of you will be aware, there's been a sense that perhaps people learn in different ways. These scientific findings made us rethink how we support our schools, and I suppose in a way gave us a confidence to think we really must share this with schools and with teachers so they have this information at their fingertips. And it presents the reason that we are communicating a particular set of teaching practices as being the most effective. So what does the research tell us about this learning process? First of all, it involves a change in long-term memory, and that's probably something that we all kind of intuitively know. But the process of achieving that change in long-term memory has quite specific features. First of all, we know that it's our working memory that accesses new content, and our working memory's capacity is quite limited. In fact, the average adult can only hold 3 or 4 new pieces of information in their working memory at any one time. So if we want our students to be able to take in the new content that we are prioritizing in that lesson, we need to create clear air for them. We need to manage their cognitive load, if you like. If somebody is bombarded with a whole lot of new information, if there's disruption going on in the classroom, if they are experiencing cultural dissonance, if they feel excluded, all of those things are going to get in the way of them engaging with the key new content as part of their learning journey. So we know that focus and attention on new content is important. We also know that if a person has existing knowledge that's related to the new content, that new content will find its way more easily into their working memory and stick in their working memory and transition into the long-term memory. So that knowledge is sticky, knowledge builds upon knowledge is an important part of this understanding as well. We know that practice helps consolidate learning in the long-term memory, and we also know that immediate practice helps to retain new content in the working memory long enough for it to transition into the long-term memory. So with immediate practice, scaffolded practice, somebody can retain that information long enough for it to transition, and then with spaced recall and practicing at intervals and practicing in varied situations, the knowledge becomes embedded in the long-term memory, and neural pathways start to connect between those different circumstances of application of that knowledge, building more sophisticated schema in the mind. And that sets our students up very well to apply that knowledge independently, to exercise their critical and creative thinking in new environments, applying the knowledge that they've taken on board. So what does this mean for teaching? We've got our 4 elements of teaching on the right-hand side there. And the first point I want to make actually before I dive into explicit teaching is that these elements of teaching are sequential and they build on each other. And the arrows going around the boxes on the slide illustrate that. First of all, we have the planning stage. Now, of course, our teachers are undertaking planning at the moment. The purpose of putting planning into this model is really to draw out the key activities that need to be occurring for the most effective outcomes in that planning element. So one of those planning activities is identifying what are the specific learning outcomes that we want to achieve in each lesson. How are we going to sequence the knowledge that we're going to impart in each lesson? How are we going to break down that knowledge and chunk it into bite-sized and logically sequenced chunks? And how are we going to set up our classroom so that children feel included, students, young people feel included, have a sense of belonging, they feel safe, the pattern of the classroom is predictable, they feel that they are culturally accepted, they feel culturally safe, and they feel ready to learn and able to focus on that learning. Those final points that I was mentioning there relate heavily to the enabling learning element of teaching. So enabling learning is all about positive relationships, cultural responsiveness, classroom expectations, and positive management, setting the context up and supporting students so that they can focus on that new content. And then we come to explicit teaching and supported application, which are the teacher's active practices in the classroom and the student's engagement with the new content. So explicit teaching in the Victorian teaching and learning model is a teacher-led and highly interactive approach. It recognises the teacher as the expert in the room, and it is dynamic and super engaging. I was speaking at one of our area principal forums not long ago, and a young teacher stood up and did a demonstration, and we were all engaged in this little segment of her explicit teaching classroom. It was a very dynamic and vibrant experience. The elements of explicit teaching that are drawn out in the VTLM2 are activating prior knowledge, stating clear learning objectives, providing explicit explanations of new knowledge in manageable chunks, using practices like I do, we do, you do. So that's that. I'm going to show you, then we're going to do it together. I'm going to support you to do it. And as you demonstrate that you understand and you have the confidence and the ability to do this, I will gradually fade away my supports and leave you to demonstrate it independently. It involves frequently checking for understanding throughout lessons, and following those checks for understanding. Critically, it involves the teacher responding and adapting teaching, either to explain further, provide further modelling, a bit more support, or to accelerate if students have mastered that that content. A key finding about this practice, and explicit teaching is obviously not the only way to teach. There are other approaches of teaching that can be effective for some students or somewhat effective for more students, but at a population level of supporting all our students to access the curriculum content, explicit teaching is the most effective. It's effective for all, essential for some, and harmful for none. Here's a little picture of the sorts of things that you might see in schools that are demonstrating explicit teaching practices and other practices related to other teaching practices from those other elements of teaching in the VTLM2. So across the top, we've got what you might see at a whole school level: structures and systems to plan curriculum delivery, consistent use of a VTLM2 aligned instructional model, and whole school approaches to enabling learning. And we know that where a whole school takes the same approach to expectations of behaviour and setting up classrooms in an inclusive way, first of all, it becomes more predictable for our students, so it lightens the cognitive load on our students. And secondly, it takes a bit of pressure off individual teachers because they're all reinforcing each other's practices. So it makes for a happier and more streamlined environment, if you like. It takes the focus off that and leaves people free to focus on what they're there to learn. Across the bottom, we've got practices that you might see in classrooms: teacher-led instruction, of course, high levels of participation and student engagement, and regular review and retrieval of content. There are other practices that you would certainly see. These are just some as a bit of a selection to give you a flavour of what classrooms might be like. The final thing I'll say before I pass over to Louise to talk about the new reading approach is that we're very conscious that some of these concepts have been around for some time, and sometimes words like explicit can have unhelpful connotations attached to them. They can sound more didactic, more sort of, in the teaching profession, it's known as chalk and talk or drill and kill. And I wanted to spend a moment just sort of unpacking some of that. The VTLM2 offers a set of approaches, a set of principles. We hand those to teachers and invite them to apply those principles in a way that is responsive to their students' existing knowledge. Of course, the way that they enable learning in their classroom will be responsive to the specific cultures that are represented among their student cohort, for example, and to implement these approaches at the pace and with the level of scaffolding that their students require. So it is very much a model that is designed to support responsive and adaptive teaching, and responsive adaptive teaching that is focused on the students in the room, drawing on the teacher's professional expertise. There are some other models people may be familiar with. One's called direct instruction, one's called explicit direct instruction. These two models, direct instruction, emerged in the 1960s, EDI emerged in the 1980s. Both of them utilize the principles of explicit teaching, and they represent particular ways of applying those. So direct instruction is quite scripted, more formulaic, if you like. Explicit direct instruction is a model and a way of applying explicit teaching principles. They may be the right models to use in particular circumstances. They are not the only way of applying these principles, and the purpose of the department offering this set of elements to our teaching profession, as we have without a prescribed sort of model, is really to support our teachers to exercise their professional expertise and apply them in a responsive way to their student cohort. So I'll hand over to Louise for the next slide to talk to you about the new approach to reading.
Thanks, Lucinda, and it's lovely to be invited to present at this meeting today. So thank you very much for having us all. So I'm really going to just continue on from Lucinda's presentation of the VTLM 2.0 with a focus on cognitive load theory and the place of explicit teaching to optimize the learning conditions for all students in the class. So that's what we're really trying to do with all of this work, is create the conditions that enable learning for every student. So that includes, regardless of culture, regardless of disadvantage, trauma, all of these considerations are taken in when we look at the VTLM 2.0 and how we plan for consideration of all the needs of our students to meet them where they are. So the reading approach that Victoria is implementing from 2025 was announced by Minister Carroll on the 13th of June at the Ages Schools Summit. And what it talks to is very much decades of evidence, agreed evidence, around what is the most effective and efficient way for students to learn to read. And the reading approach that primary schools will be asked to implement from 2025 is a minimum of 25 minutes of systematic synthetic phonics daily in foundation to year 2 and as well as in specialist settings that have primary age students. It is to be taught within the context of the Big Six. So we know that phonics and phonemic awareness is absolutely foundational and critical, like oral language, to language development and literacy skills and reading. But we also need the rest of the Big Six to enable students to be successful at reading and writing and really making meaning of all the text that they use. So while at the moment the policy is very clear around F2, as we move through implementing reading and literacy and the English curriculum, we will be demonstrating how to teach explicitly the other components of the Big Six, which will be done through decodable text initially as students build their fluency to meaning making, and then which will be the first hour of every day in F2, and then with the phonics and phonemic awareness. And then the second hour will be based around increasingly complex fiction and non-fiction text study, where we really support students to build the world of the text. We call it a knowledge-rich experience for students, which the evidence tells us, like systematic synthetic phonics, has the absolute biggest outcome for our most disadvantaged students, giving them access to the cultural capital of our less disadvantaged students, and providing them with the explicit knowledge required to be successful at school at every single stage. So that's the basic underpinning theory. As I said, we've only released F2, but we will start to build on this idea of the Big Six and what it looks like at different ages and stages. And when Tim talks about the English lesson plans, he will unpack that for you a little more. So how we're supporting schools to do this, next slide please, Lucinda. So this, for some schools, is a very big change. For other schools, they have been doing this work for quite some time with huge success, and for all cohorts of students. So regardless of students' background, starting point, EAL, refugee, highly successful schools, regardless of starting point, many schools in Victoria have been doing this work successfully for quite some time and have seen the impact of it. But we also have some schools for whom this will be the first time they've done this work. So we have developed the Phonics Plus program for schools, which is free and is a comprehensive program that provides lesson plans, will provide lesson plans for teachers and students in Foundation Year 1 and Year 2 by June 2025. But it also provides all the resources required to teach this explicitly and using a synthetic phonics approach. So that we've already started to put that on ARC. It is freely available to anyone. So some of our other sectors have asked, so they have access to these resources as well. And it's really important to us that if we're putting out the requirement of schools to do this work, that we really provide them with a high quality program that they can use to implement this reading position. Because as you mentioned at the beginning of the session, it is really the most critical and fundamental measure of life outcomes, the ability to read and success with literacy generally. That's me. Thanks, Lucinda.
Thanks all. Thanks, Louise. I'll just talk to you very briefly about lesson plans. Obviously, Louise has outlined some bits in relation to English and more specifically about the phonics lesson plans and curriculum resources that are coming to help schools to implement the mandated part of expectations around a systematic synthetic phonics program, but also they'll have various other supplementary resources to assist schools to implement a more structured literacy approach. Victorian lesson plans in general provide a commitment to provide over 4,000 lessons and supporting resources, as my colleagues have talked about, that aim to support schools to plan the curriculum in a really purposeful way, bringing the curriculum to life and breaking down the content, knowledge and skills into smaller steps to support teachers to plan effectively, and putting a greater emphasis on the value and importance of knowledge, and ensuring that students are supported to acquire core knowledge and key skills in different areas. The lesson plans illustrate the curriculum at an ambitious level. So it's at the level, obviously, of the content descriptors in the curriculum, but they're an ambitious set of resources, which we hope will provide really challenging but stimulating content for schools. And in different subject areas, they'll also demonstrate, I suppose, different things about good practice in those subject areas. So, for instance, in English, texts that are selected are increasingly challenging, rich and varied. Prominence of Australian authors and First Nations writers and texts from Asia Pacific region to reflect cross-curriculum priorities. But in English also, you'll see a strong emphasis on the explicit teaching of vocabulary, which we know is really important, and structured and explicit teaching of grammar and other things that support students to read, write, speak, and listen well. In mathematics as well, there'll be an emphasis on explicit teaching in mathematics, and also a range of supporting resources to enable schools to implement retrieval practice and insights about cognitive science into their programs in maths and in other subject areas. Lesson plans will be available in English, maths, science, and then next year, starting to flow in the middle of the year, will be design technologies, digital technologies, and science. And also, once the A to D curriculum's published by the VCAA, there'll be supporting resources to help schools, both specialist and mainstream schools, to implement the A to D curriculum as well. Just an interesting point for you, just in terms of the design of these materials. We're trying to be mindful across the board with the materials that we produce, the advice that we produce, that it is grounded in the best available evidence, and that for us means drawing on insights from meta-analysis and from evidence clearinghouses, evidence organisations, like our own Australian Educational Research Organisation. So we've used their guidance in relation to writing and writing instruction. That's prominent in our English lessons. We've used various aspects of their guidance to support the development and design of the pedagogy that's at the heart of lessons. Also, from a subject-specific stance, we've extensively drawn on insights from Evidence for Learning, which distills evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK and reinterprets that for an Australian context. And these are two of the reports that feature prominently in the design of these different subject areas. So improving primary science, for instance, is very strongly advocates for lessons that emphasize vocabulary teaching in science, which is systematic, but also teaching about the anticipation of misconceptions and how we deal with that within primary and secondary science lessons. And you'll see some of those insights from these subject reviews and subject reports. You'll see them evident in the design of the materials that are published.
Thanks very much, Tim. So I think now, Deb, do I hand back to you?
Yes, thanks
and we
so much.
go.
That's great.
And would you mind, Deb, if I took the slides down?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just conscious I haven't been able to see the chat function, so
That's okay.
I apologise if I haven't responded to
No.
anybody.
No. And the VCOSS team will help us make our way through the material that's come through the chat. So first of all, just want to thank Department of Education colleagues for a really comprehensive presentation. You can see the thought that's been put into this and the research base for the work. We're going to go to some audience questions in a moment, but I guess one of the things that I might kind of kick off with is that I guess a key message that I heard was a common thread through all the different presentations was really this is about kind of optimizing, or this approach will seek to kind of optimize the conditions of learning for all students, regardless of background, and then I guess applying an overlay. I think there was a reference to like planning for consideration of those other factors. I guess given that many of the people on this call from the community sector are working with children and young people that have had adverse childhood experiences, there's a reference earlier in the presentations to building on prior knowledge, and that's prior knowledge obviously that's been built up at school, but thinking about prior knowledge built up in or developed through other contexts such as family, home, community, etc. And again, thinking about the children and young people that so many community sector organisations support, like might have been deprived of some of those kind of enriching experiences. So there's still prior knowledge, and that is like very valuable. Everyone's knowledge is valued, but it's a different type of prior knowledge. It's not necessarily the same type of knowledge that their peers in the classroom have. So I'm kind of keen to understand a little bit more about what the kind of baseline kind of looks like in terms of creating that, optimal learning environment for all students, and then how through this explicit instruction approach, then we might kind of account for factors such as adverse childhood experiences. Is someone from the DE team able to speak to that, please? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deb. That is a great question, and I will make a start and then invite Tim or Louise to jump in if they'd like to add to it. So this is actually one of the things that most excites me about this reform. What has come through in the evidence is that other teaching approaches, for example, an inquiry-based student-led approach, with the best will in the world, sadly, the evidence shows that they actually play to those who come from more advantaged backgrounds, who have existing knowledge and therefore can have more of a context to direct their own inquiry, for example. And in fact, it sells short those who enter our schools with less cultural capital or social capital in their backpacks, so to speak. And the lovely thing about the explicit teaching approach is that it prompts all of our teachers to think about what existing knowledge do my kids have? How am I going to make this real for them? How am I going to make this make sense? And then to explicitly explain, and everybody in the classroom is listening to that explicit explanation, and then supporting kids so that they can achieve success. Now, there might be some kids who move more quickly and some kids who move more slowly, but we know from seeing this operate in schools that have already implemented it, and including schools in some very low socioeconomic communities, that the thrill of experiencing success in learning not only lifts student engagement ongoing, but also student confidence and kind of commitment and motivation to embrace the next step in learning, and that feeds sequentially and builds that learning progression, and is really tremendously exciting. A brief word on their enabling learning environment, which I think was the first part of your classroom. That that is going to have some consistency, but also some variation across our classrooms. And that will be because the things that you do in one classroom to enable learning may be different from what another cohort of students needs. And that could be around which behavioural norms we choose to embed, what's going to work in that community. It could be around which particular cultures we're thinking about in setting up cultural responsiveness, and that could vary as well, given the wonderful richness and diversity of cultures around our globe and here in this country. So it may look different, but the principles underpinning it of creating a safe, predictable, inclusive environment where students feel that they belong and they have that kind of clear air to focus on new learning will be consistent. Louise, did you want to add anything to that?
I don't think so. I do. The team did develop this in very close conjunction with the disability and inclusion and behaviour support team. So there's a lot of consideration, and if once you get a chance to have a look in more detail around multi-tiered systems of support, and that's across all areas of learning. So it does include the behavioural support. So how do we create a high quality, optimal environment for learning for all students to initially a psychologically safe, culturally safe and responsive, trauma informed environment that gives everyone access to the curriculum, and then uses that cognitive load theory to really break up the learning into achievable chunks for every student, gives them lots of opportunity to practice and to retrieve. So that is helpful for all students, as Lucinda said at the beginning, but especially helpful for our students who have a lot going on for them for, whatever reason that might be. So absolutely, this has been done in conjunction with the behaviour supports and the disability and inclusion part of the department, as well as COD, I believe, Lucinda.
Thanks so much, Lucinda and Louise. And Lucinda, I really want to particularly note, I can hear the enthusiasm and the passion in your voice, which is really, really great. We're pleased that you're excited about the potential to kind of shift the dial for all students, but particularly the students that we in the community sector particularly care about in terms of those most kind of vulnerable to missing out on their, universal entitlement to education. Just on that, I know that some of my colleagues on the call from the community sector, and I can see Sally Laslett's name on the screen, for example, from Hester Hornbrook Academy. So we've got many community sector organisations who are working with young children, but we've also got community sector organisations that are working with young people who I guess have just fallen through the gaps of our education system over many years. And I'm just thinking about, how might this approach to reading instruction be applied to support older students that are behind with their reading? I have a double-barreled question in a second in terms of what that looks like for young people who might not be in government schools. They might be in schools like Sally's and those that other community sector organisations are running. But we just start with the first part of my question, which is how might the new approach to reading instruction be applied to support older students that are behind with their reading? Thank you.
So the big six that we've talked about is the universal architecture for how our brain works and how our brain orthographic maps letters and sounds onto it. So everyone learns to read in the same way fundamentally. So it is relevant for early years. If we want to optimize how students learn in the early years, the evidence tells us systematic synthetic phonics. If students have missed that instruction, which is common, or there may be a learning difficulty or disability that has not been picked up yet, then this approach is still relevant for those students. But we would strongly recommend that you assess to ensure you're really clear on what are the gaps in the students' learning for older students. Things that can accelerate learning according to the evidence, and this is Amina McLean, who is an academic who's worked with us on this. So there may be phonic and phonemic awareness work that has to be done if that's what the evidence is telling you. But fluency practice is another really critical enabler of comprehension. So making sure that students have the requisite background knowledge, vocabulary to be able to read at a speed that enables them to comprehend. So I guess what I'm saying, it's not a simple answer, The Big Six will be fundamental and underpin all of our work across all the year levels. And explicit teaching of the Big Six is necessary at every age. So, it is important, depending on what the assessment tells us students need. So once they can decode and encode, then we can put some more emphasis on morphology and spelling, on fluency, vocabulary and comprehension. And then as they move up into the years, they still have to do spelling. They still have to learn about spelling rules, morphology, building their vocabulary every time they're taught a new text or a new book or a new subject, every time they're in a new subject. And then the comprehension of that is really fundamental. So I've worked in secondary schools in really diverse school settings with students from all different backgrounds. This is absolutely necessary for all students. There is a question about students who can already read. So just like any classroom, schools will have to take this program, and it can be flexibly implemented, which means you assess where your students are at and you need to teach them at that point of need, basically. So students who may not need decodable text, you do need to make sure that they can spell, because often they get to year 3 and because they haven't got all their letter sound correspondences, they're not able to spell. So we start to see students' results being impacted in that way. But, once students have built their ability to decode fluently, they then move on to reading more complex fiction and non-fiction text. So it's a very long answer, but it's not a simple answer. The evidence tells us removing students from an English class is not necessarily the best way to ensure that they have access to high quality curriculum. We want every single student to have access to high quality tier 1 instruction in English and text, so they get exposure to interesting texts and ideas just like everyone else. So it's thinking about how you make that intervention time work for students in secondary. And it may be, before school, after school, whatever you can negotiate with the student in class. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer.
Thank you for that. That's fine. It's Deb speaking again. And just the other part of my question was just to kind of clarify with the reforms that are being described today, these are being rolled out in government schools. Again, I'm thinking about independent schools that community sector organisations are running. And increasingly we're seeing kind of the offer kind of being front-ended to kind of like middle years and things like that. Previously it was kind of at that senior secondary kind of equivalent age. If this reform is being run out in government schools, but, independent schools such as those run by community sector organisations are wanting to access resources, be part of this reform agenda, what's the opportunity for that to look like? I know earlier on, I think Lucinda, you were mentioning, or Mark, communities of practice, as well as kind of online resources and things like that. How widely accessible would these resources be?
Yeah, it's a great question, Deb. So our resources on our website, on our policy and advisory library, and that will be on our ARC platform, will be accessible to anyone in the public, actually, who can download them and have a look. We are also reaching out directly to the other sectors, and we've engaged with both the Melbourne Archdiocese of Catholic Schools and with Independent Schools Victoria, and we'll continue to do so. And we have an active conversation. The department has an active relationship, as you'd expect, with both those organisations. So it's there for the taking. It's an expectation of government schools. I would say that I think that the winds of change, if you like, in the policy atmosphere that we all operate in are moving in a favourable direction for these reforms. So we are not the only system thinking about this, and I'm sure members will have seen in the media, New South Wales's curriculum support materials, various other states and jurisdictions thinking about this. I would be very surprised if we're not seeing similar movements in our other two schooling sectors. Tim, do you want to say something about the availability of lesson plans?
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to reinforce what Lucinda's said, the intention is to have those materials available for use across different sectors. They'll be publicly available, searchable from anywhere. The ARC learning platform you can access from anywhere in the world. And in fact, it does have access points from different countries as well, where people will log on and download and use resources. The only caveat to that is that there may be limited amounts of resources that relate to English that are about specific text extracts that might a bit sit behind a login, but that's only where we couldn't secure copyright at a reasonable price. So wherever it's possible, the materials will be publicly available. Lesson plans more generally, and actually even the use of Phonics Plus lesson plans is not mandated. Like, schools don't have to do that, but there's obviously strong encouragement to use the materials because we believe they're, of great quality, highly aligned to the curriculum, and supportive of bringing the Victorian teaching and learning model to life in classrooms. So we kind of strongly encourage their use.
Thank you
The
so
other thing
much. Sorry, let's go.
Oh, sorry, Deb. I just thought of something else I wanted to add. Victoria, along with the other states and territories, has worked to develop a national teacher workforce action plan. And one of the commitments that the Commonwealth Government made under that was to fund the development of 3 micro-credentials for teachers. And they are in classroom management, explicit teaching, and teaching phonics. And they've engaged with us extensively in the development of those micro-credentials, and they are aligned with our position, the Victorian position in those areas, and they're progressively becoming available. So I think 2 of them are live at the moment, and the 3rd's due to become live before the end of the year for any teacher. So any teacher across any system can access professional learning in that way. And then, of course, additional professional learning supported by their schools or their system.
Thank you so much. I guess another observation that I have is that we often talk about in our sector, and I know the Department of Education speaks in this way, about parents and carers as first educators as well. So I'm thinking about with this kind of new approach, what's the kind of what is the kind of engagement that kind of wraps around with parents and carers, and again thinking about the interests of the community sector, thinking about we have children and young people that our sector is supporting where parents and carers really want to see their children succeed in education. They perhaps, where there's been intergenerational disadvantage, they can be quite scared of the kind of the school environment. They can be lacking confidence in their ability to support their children with learning. So I'm wondering about how we're kind of bringing along parents and carers in this journey, and the particular overlay in terms of supporting positive engagement and relationships of trust with parents and carers that might have their own vulnerabilities.
Thanks, Deb. Another really good question. And we have reached out to Parents Victoria to start a conversation about how we can support parents and caregivers. As a parent myself, I completely agree with you that parents are definitely the first educators and come from a range of starting points. Of course, as you mentioned, some very embedded and highly educated, and others who haven't had those opportunities. And then, other children who are living in out-of-home care and are moving from school to school, perhaps as a result of that, or in families, for example, military families that are constantly relocated. One of the strengths of this reform and embedding these approaches right across our system is the implementation of consistent, effective approaches. So whatever school a child or a student walks into, they will experience similar approaches once all this is implemented. And I think that's really important because it will help to address that disadvantage that comes through dislocation from a particular school environment. So that's the first thing that I would say. But in terms of broader supports for parents and caregivers, Parents Victoria has been kind enough to offer to work with us in developing materials that will provide very tailored supports to areas of parents' interest. One of the things that came up in our recent conversation was the question of the process of implementation and how we're all heading to the same destination, but there could well be variation. In fact, there's undoubtedly going to be variation across our schools in their order or sequence of their reform activities, the implementation activities they undertake. And I understand that could be quite perplexing to parents that, you know, Jane at her school, they're doing a big surge on phonics, whereas my kids' school, they don't seem to be doing that at all. They're all focused on behavioural norms. You know, what's going on here? That kind of perplexity and that variation in how schools choose to sequence their implementation is going to be worked out between school leaders in consultation with our regional colleagues based on a school's readiness for implementation and, you know, do their teachers need more professional learning before they can get going on some of their the more teaching elements, if you like, or is there a greater need for them to start in numeracy than in phonics or vice versa? So there could be some variation in the sequencing, and that'll be something that we'll need to communicate carefully so that our schools are not kind of caught as the meat in the sandwich, and our parents are supported and reassured that it all will happen. We are taking this incrementally because we know that incremental implementation is more sustainable. We have a 3-year window to implement, and we'll get there at the end, but the path may look different.
Thank you.
Can I just jump in? Sorry,
we've got a minute left. So yes, so thank you, Louise.
So we have been talking to the early years sector. So we are trying to get alignment around the resources. It's fair to say it's a lot of discussion around the play-based space because that is at times can be in conflict with explicit teaching, but we certainly are meeting with them regularly. We've also met with VAI and we meet regularly with Career Outcomes Division. With the phonics reading position, we will have a career parent information that will go out in the books and prep bags at the beginning of the year. So it's written by our career colleagues, which they believe is a better fit for some of their families and communities. We'll have it translated into other languages. And we do have for early years of school, there will be in the preps and book bags more information for families around the role that they can play in supporting this work.
Thank you. Now, I'm conscious we're right on 2:30. I think as we wrap up, I want to thank all my departmental colleagues. I want to thank the VCOSS team as well. Joe Hatcher in particular, our education policy advisor, but supported by colleagues such as Noah Hurst and Amy Houston in our communications team, who has just literally returned from a year of parental leave and hopped straight into 2 big VCOSS events today. I think as we wrap up, one kind of thing that I would maybe Lucinda to invite or one of the other colleagues from the department is, what's a kind of key message that you want to share back with the community sector? We've got a really important role to play. We are that kind of trusted source of relationship and advice and expertise with families. And just wondering, you know, any kind of key messages from you about how the community sector can support the success of these reforms and be involved. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deb. I think the key message is really that we're really keen to work with you. We know that you bring huge amounts of expertise to the various areas of the community or various cohorts within the community that you support. And we're very keen to, I suppose, provide access to information about these reforms and the evidence base supporting them, because we are really excited about what they offer to many of the communities that you're all working with. And if you've got questions, please approach us. And if you'd like to be involved in giving us advice on how we can best reach out to your communities, we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks so much. It's a lovely note to wrap up on. Just as I finish up, I do want to make a note for those who are still on the call with it. We've got an evaluation form in the chat. Really encourage you to fill that in because it helps us know how these events have landed with you, what works well, what doesn't, what future ideas you have for this work that we do with the Department of Education to, I guess, you know, raise awareness of some of the kind of key reforms that are going on, help make sense of them and help kind of connect up the department with community sector leaders. So please fill out that evaluation form. Thanks again to the Department of Education for our partnership and for making yourselves available to speak with the sector today. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and look forward to the next time we get together. Thank you.